Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughn Manor, where I'm talking about my fantasy plan. It's my fantasy plan, or my plan, or my plans for fantasy. My plans for fantasy. So I've done like a TBR for the fantasy books I need to read, but I actually kind of sat down and thought about it, and I thought about, okay, what order am I going to read this stuff in? Because fantasy could be a big investment in time when it comes to reading. Anybody who's familiar with modern fantasy in particular knows how gigantic fantasy novels can be. And although I'm not going to be reading a ton of modern stuff, there's one modern thing at least in here. They're still pretty long as far as the series go for the most part. What I'm thinking about reading for fantasy. So I'm doing a lot of things as far as reading goes, particularly this year. I've got a lot of stuff going on. I've got Vintage Science Fiction Project. I've got Edgar Rice Burroughs Deep Dive that I'm doing. I've got Stephen King, reading every book by, which I'm going to get back to next month. I've got so much stuff going on that I wanted to be careful about how I thought about, okay, where am I going to fit the fantasy in that I want to read? And because of the amount of stuff that I'm going to be reading, which includes Roger's Cheap Old Book Club, which debuts in February, that's going to be a priority. Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. But also fantasy. It's got to be in there somewhere because there are a bunch of fantasy books that I want to read. So I thought about, okay, what am I going to be reading next as far as fantasy? What am I going to be reading after that? And so on. So these are the fantasy series that I've got coming up, probably this year and next year. These are the series that I'm going to focus on. And I've already mentioned that this is going to be this next one. This one's going to be the next fantasy book or books that I read, and that is going to be this series from our own Brian Lee Durfee, who has his own BookTube channel, the amazing Brian Lee Durfee, who has written the 5 Warrior Angels trilogy, which is now complete and ready for me to read. So I did attempt to listen to the first book, The Forgetting Moon, on audiobook. I mentioned that as well and how unsuccessful I was. I tend to suck at audiobooks, and even though it was fantastic, I kept thinking as I was listening, man, I really want to read this book. I know I would get a better experience because this is great. So I'm going to be reading The Forgetting Moon by Brian Lee Durfee in the near future. Oh, and I'm filming on Monday, so of course the garbage truck, which hasn't come all day, was waiting for me to film a video, and now it's showing up. So anyway, this is what I get for filming videos on Mondays. The Forgetting Moon by Brian Lee Durfee. This is the next book I'll be reading for fantasy, and it is the first of the 5 Warrior Angels trilogy by Brian Lee Durfee, and it is, it's a good-sized book. How long is this? This book is, it's got appendices. It's fancy. This is 763 pages long. So this is a fair-sized book that is followed by The Blackest Heart, which is even bigger. This is even a bigger book. How big is this book? This is 928 pages. So this is shaping up to be a modern fantasy series in that it's got gigantic books. And finally, The Lonesome Crown by Brian Lee Durfee, where he finishes off his saga. So yeah, this is that's a lot of reading there. So this is going to be the next fantasy series that I read. When will I start it? Probably in March, maybe. I'll read the first book, and then I'll read it every few books. I'll read a fantasy book. I'm working out exactly how I'm going to stagger these things, all my different projects. I'm actually going to work out a system. It's genius. It's not genius. So that's the first thing I'm going to read. the first fantasy thing I'm going to read is Brian Lee Durfee's Five Warrior Angels trilogy, because that looks awesome. And following that, I'm finally going to revisit one of my favorite fantasy heroes of all, which would be Elric. Elric of Melniboné. So Elric, I'm going to reread the Elric series. And I'm going to do it in an odd way. I'm not going to do it like I thought I was going to do it. I thought I was going to read the new fancy hardcover editions. But when I was recently going over the Elric series, I realized that the Del Rey set, while it's written more or less in chronological order, not chronological order, it's written more or less in the order of composition, which is definitely not chronological as far as the character's history is concerned. I decided to read the Del Rey set because there's more Elric in here. There's a bunch of stuff in the Del Rey set that's not in the new hardcover edition. As beautiful and wonderful as the new hardcover edition is, it doesn't have some of the stuff that's in the Del Rey set, in that it doesn't have, like this set has like scripts and stories that aren't actually in the hardcover set for whatever reason. So, yeah, I'll just go, I'm going to read the Del Rey edition because I have read Elric through once before. And that was back when Elric was in paperback, the little paperbacks that you used to be able to get in the olden days, the old mass markets. That's how I read Elric the first time. But now I'm going to be reading the Del Rey set, and that's quite a few books. That's The Stealer of Souls here, To Rescue Tanalorn, The Sleeping Sorceress, Duke Elric. We've got In the Dream Realms, and Swords and Roses. Swords and Roses being the last volume of the Del Rey set. But that's not all the Elric that there is. There's more Elric after this. After that comes this trilogy of novels that were written later in the early 2000s that are not part of that Del Rey set, but are part of the hardcover set. So this is volume 3 of the Elric saga, the new hardcover set. So everything in here is in the hardcover set, but not vice versa, as far as the first 2 volumes of the hardcover set are concerned. But this has the 3 novels, The Dream Thief's Daughter, The Skraeling Tree, and The White Wolf's Son, which make up this trilogy of books that was written in the early 2000s. So these Elric stories are not in Del Rey. So this is the book I'll be reading after the Del Rey set. And then, of course, the brand new Elric novel that was just released and is the latest and the last Elric novel in the Elric saga, unless he writes some more, which I would be perfectly happy for him to do. And so all of that, see, confusing the way I'm reading Elric, but that's how I'm reading Elric. So that's the next thing, the next fantasy thing that I'm going to read. And that's a pretty good investment in time. That's a lot of Elric. So after that, what am I going to be reading? Well, after that, I'm going to tackle this big guy. This is the Great Book of Amber. So this is the Complete Amber Chronicles, Volume 1 through 10, by Roger Zelazny, who is an author I like, although I have never read any of his Amber books. And this has all 10 of them in this big, fatty volume. So, you know, it's gigantic, but it'll knock 10 books off my 500 book challenge, so that's a good thing right there. So yeah, the Great Book of Amber, all the Amber books. I've gotten, like I've said before, I've gotten mixed feedback on this. Some people say they're great. Some people say a lot of them suck. Some people say half the series is great. Half the series sucks. People say different things, but I'm going to judge for myself. This is the series I'll be reading after Elric. After that is not a series. It's just a standalone book. an old one. This is The Worm Ouroboros, E.R. Edison's The Worm Ouroboros. This is a book I read as a kid, probably 13 or 14 years old actually, so a teenager technically. And I don't really remember much about it, except that the language in this volume gave me difficulty as a young person, although I read the first couple pages and it doesn't seem like it's going to give me any difficulty as an old man. So this is what I'll be reading after Amber. See, I've got it all planned out, guys. It's all planned out. After that, I'm going to read a couple of things that, I'm including them in the fantasy, although they're not really fantasy. Or are they? They're fantasy adjacent. Now, I had a long discussion with Roger. I'm doing it anyway, Roger. Roger says, no, these books that you're talking about are science fiction. They're science fiction books, Mike. They're not fantasy. And I said, well, everybody's telling me that they're kind of fantasy, or at least they've influenced fantasy. And so Roger and I have had an argument about it, but I'm going to read them anyway as part of my fantasy reading, even though they are science fiction, particularly this next one. This is Tales of the Dying Earth by Jack Vance. So yes, just look at that cover, science fiction. But apparently it's very, very similar to fantasy in a lot of ways. This has all the tales of the dying earth, I think. Let me know if it's missing any. This has the dying earth, the eyes of the overworld, Kujel's saga, and Rialto the Marvelous. So all that's in this volume of the Tales of the Dying Earth. Now I wanted to read this because this was said to be, or has been said to be, influential on the last series of books that I'm going to be reading, which again Roger says are science fiction, and yeah, but it's kind of fantasy also, and that would be these books, which I cannot believe I have not read yet. So this is the Book of the New Sun. This is, well, the books of the New Sun, but together they make the Book of the New Sun, and this is actually 4 books, I guess. Yeah, this is the first half of it. This has, what do you have? You have the Shadow of the Torturer and the Claw of the Conciliator, which is the first half of the Book of the New Sun, Shadow and Claw by Gene Wolfe. So yeah, apparently this series of books had some influence at least on this series of books. So I definitely wanted to read The Dying Earth first before I read this, just for my own interest. So yeah, there's that. And then, of course, the second half, and this has the Sword of the Lictor and the Citadel of the Autarch. Yes, the Citadel of the Autarch. Very fantasy-like titles, and just look at that cover. It's very fantasy-looking to me. It's very fantasy-looking to me, I think. So, yeah, and then eventually, the next thing we're going to read fantasy-wise, after all of that is done, is I'm going to return to the Lord of the Rings. And this time I'm just going to read it all as one book. I tried reading it in bits and pieces before. Like, I'll just read Fellowship of the Ring, and then eventually didn't work. So the next fantasy thing I'm going to read is the Lord of the Rings. And yeah, that's what I'll read. And then I will decide at the time when I finally get there whether I'll add some other Tolkien stuff in there. Maybe read a bunch of Tolkien all in one go. Why not? That's the next thing. Now, there are a lot of people talking about A Song of Ice and Fire lately. And reading that series of books, or rereading that series of books by George R.R. Martin, which was famously adapted into the television show Game of Thrones. I thought about that, but that series is not finished. And I've always said that I will read that series again when one of two things happen. Either the series gets finished or George R.R. Martin dies. Which I hope is not for, decades. But which one of those things will happen first? I'm hoping that he finishes A Song of Ice and Fire before he dies. That's what I'm hoping. That's what all of us are hoping for, I think. What will actually happen, though, who knows? I have a suspicion about which one of those events will happen first. But I'm going to remain hopeful. And someday when that series is finished, then I'll read it. Yeah, so that's my fantasy plan. That's my fantasy plan. I'm going to sneak those in along with everything else I'm going to read. And I'm actually coming up with a whole system about how I'm going to read different things. Because I've got so many different things I want to read, so I'm putting together like a little, Roger and I are working on a chart. Okay, I'll read this then and this and this. It's all very involved and possibly ridiculous. But I will explain all that in another video. Man, it's going to be so exciting. I bet you can hardly wait for that video to show up. So yeah, that's all I have for you for today. Catch me tomorrow for Epic Comic Book Wednesday, where I will be talking about something different than Steve will be talking about, probably. And then on Thursday, I have no idea. On Thursday or Friday, I'll be back. One of those days I won't be here, and one of those days I will be here, probably. And I will be talking more sword and sorcery. More sword and sorcery on one of those 2 days. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.